From Eyewitness News, this is Newsmakers.
Welcome to this special edition of Newsmakers, a Democratic primary debate among the major candidates for mayor of Providence. Hello, I'm Tim White. Whoever wins the Democratic primary for mayor on September 9th will go on to face the Republican nominee and independent Vincent Buddy Cianci. During this hour-long debate, we'll try to show you the differences between the two Democratic candidates looking for your vote. And they are, from left to right on your screen, Jorge Elorza and Michael Solomon. We'll hear from them in a moment. I will be moderating this debate and asking questions along with WPRI.com reporter Ted Nesi. We will begin with 1-minute opening statements from each of our candidates. The order was determined by a drawing. Up first is Jorge Elorza. Most recently, Mr. Elorza was a housing court judge for the city of Providence, a lawyer. He has worked for Rhode Island Legal Services and is a professor at Roger Williams University School of Law. He's a graduate of the University of Rhode Island and Harvard Law School. Mr. Elorza, your opening remarks.
Thank you, Tim, and thank you, Ted, for having us. My name is Jorge Elorza, and I'm running for mayor because I want to create jobs in our city. I want to fix our schools, and I want to change the culture at City Hall. My parents came to this country with nothing. They worked in the factories and little by little worked their way up to the middle class. But those opportunities that used to exist, they're no longer available. I want to create economic opportunity in every neighborhood. I went through the public schools. I barely graduated from high school, but people believed in me, and I ended up graduating first in my class as an accountant at URI and then graduated from Harvard Law School. Just as people believed in me, I want to open opportunities for our young people so that they can achieve their dreams. And last, we're going to change the culture at City Hall so that it's not the same old politics of the past, and we have a city government that works for you.
Thank you, Mr. Elorza. Now, Michael Solomon. Mr. Solomon was elected City Council President in 2011. He's been a member of the Providence City Council since 2007. A small businessman, Mr. Solomon owns and operates Wes's Rib House in the Olneyville section of the city. He's a graduate of LaSalle Academy. Mr. Solomon, your opening remarks.
Thanks, Tim. Thanks, Ted. I love the city. I was born here. I was raised here. Went to school here. Raised my family here. Started my businesses here. Providence has been my home my whole life. 4 years ago, I was elected council president the same day Angel Tavares took office as mayor. And immediately, we were hit with the $110 million structural deficit. We didn't have time for on-the-job training. We had to work, and we had to work together. If we were going to save the city, we were going to have to make tough decisions, decisions that had been put off far too long. And we made those decisions. And because we made those decisions, we have a $1.6 million operating surplus this year. But we need to move our city forward with a vision. And when I announced my candidacy for mayor, I said I would do 3 things: rebuild our schools, create jobs, and have quality neighborhoods. And that's what my campaign's about: schools, jobs, neighborhoods.
Thank you, Mr. Solomon. Now to the topics at hand. As you both know, there's no strict format to today's debate. We'll allow for some back and forth. In fact, we encourage it as long as it's with the topic on hand. All right, let's begin. And before we dive into debating the issues, I think it's important we address some news that broke last night. A Go Local Prov report that we have now confirmed shows a letter signed by you, Mr. Elorza, had language in it that was identical to the one written by Central Falls Mayor James Diossa 2 years ago. The paragraph was an apology for a shoplifting arrest when you were 18 years old. Was this plagiarism?
So thank you for the question. So I've made ethics and transparency a cornerstone of my campaign, so I want to address this issue directly. So I made a mistake as a teenager, and I chose to disclose this in a letter that I sent to 7,000 voters throughout the city months ago. Now, I chose to disclose this because I wanted to be upfront, and I wanted people to know that I took full responsibility. And the reason why I included it is because it's a part of my story. Just as I barely graduated from high school, just as I grew up in poverty on Cranston Street, just as I was rejected from every university that I applied to.
You haven't answered my question yet, Mr. Elorza. Was this plagiarism?
Yes. So I'll get
yes, it was plagiarism.
So this is a story of my life, and I wanted to share this directly with folks.
We get that.
And
you
I
haven't
shared
answered
this-
the question yet. Mr. Elorza, was that paragraph plagiarism? This is the issue we want to address here today.
Sure, no, for sure. And so I included that in that letter, and I had an advisor draft that letter. I sat down with the person, I related my story in my own words. They presented to me this draft, and everything that goes out in my campaign, I approve. I reviewed the letter to make sure that it was truthful, it was genuine, and it was honest, and it was all three of those things. I did not know that the language from this letter was borrowed from a previous letter. Had I known that it was, of course I would not have approved it, and of course I would not have allowed that to go out.
Judge, this is a mail piece. This wasn't an average political mail piece. This was a letter to come from your heart. You signed it. I guess the question is, was it plagiarism? That's a yes or a no in my book.
So I need to respond to this. So we all have staffers that help us with communications. I sat down with this person. I related my story in my own personal words. They presented to me this first draft. It was truthful, it was genuine, and it was honest. And when I read it, that's when I approved it. Had I known that the language was borrowed from another letter, there is no way that I would have approved it.
Mr. Solomon, do you have a response?
I'm looking for a yes or a no.
Do you feel that it was plagiarism?
Well, it's clear that the person who wrote the letter for me took and borrowed that language from another letter. That's absolutely clear. But what's also absolutely clear is that I had no idea that that had been done, and had I known, then there's no way that I would have approved that.
Mr. Elorza, in a statement last night, Mr. Solomon says you are unfit to be mayor because of this. How do you respond to that?
Yeah, that's a distraction from the real issues. The real issues here are that my opponent is facing an ethics investigation for 25 separate violations of the ethics code. There's a current ethics investigation against him. This is something that I could not have known was already out there in terms of the other letter. And this is all over an issue that I chose to disclose. My opponent is facing the ethics violations for issues that he failed to disclose. Those are the real issues, and everything else, this is a distraction.
I want to allow this conversation to continue because both of you have pegged yourselves as the ethical alternative to Buddy Cianci, so I think it's an important conversation. I'd like you to respond to the ethics violation, Mr. Solomon.
First of all, there were ethics complaints that somebody filed against me. When it was brought to my attention, there were clerical errors. When they were brought to my attention, we amended ethics reports. And we will work with the commission to be 100% in compliance. So we addressed that matter. There was a problem, we addressed the problem. I take full responsibility for my actions. There were clerical errors, and we corrected those clerical errors, and we made the amendments.
Mr. Elorza, clerical errors.
There's a very, very clear difference here. You know, this is all, and from my perspective, this is all over an issue that I purposefully and I was upfront and chose to disclose. When it comes to my opponent's challenges, this is all over an issue that he chose to not disclose, and he only
That's not true, Judge. That's not true.
After it came to light with an ethics
There was a story
complaint.
done 2 years ago.
That's a very,
Mr. Solomon,
very clear
1 minute.
difference.
Okay, go ahead, Mr. Solomon.
There was a story done 2 years ago on some of the pieces of property that I own. The thing that we failed to report were the mortgages on some of the properties. They were listed, the properties were listed, but they were listed in a different spot. And some of the mortgages weren't listed. But everything was there, it just wasn't listed in the proper places. And when you file your reports every year and nobody calls you, you assume your reports are being filed properly. And when it was brought to our attention, we made the proper amendments. We want to be in full compliance. I've had more transparency in my administration, my 3.5 years of administration on the council, than there's ever been before in city government. So it's all about transparency. We weren't trying to hide anything.
Mr. Solomon, let me follow up with you there. Should voters be concerned then that what you call a minor clerical error shows a severe lack of attention to detail that they might be concerned about if you become mayor?
Absolutely not. Absolutely not. I've worked at budgets. We've balanced budgets in the city of Providence for the last 3.5 years. And if there's an error, we correct those errors. We've been correcting problems for the last 3.5 years in the city of Providence.
Pivoting briefly, and I want to end this discussion here, but you put the blame primarily on an advisor who you say wrote that paragraph. Is that correct?
There is no way that, unless I had seen that other letter, there is no way that I could have known that that paragraph came from another letter. This advisor is no longer working for me, hasn't been working on my campaign for a very long time. I regret that this happened, but had I known that that letter and that language was taken from somewhere else, there is no way that I would have approved it.
Who was the advisor?
I am not going to throw anyone under the bus. If someone has to take the blame, the buck stops with me.
With all due respect, aren't you throwing someone under the bus? You're just not naming them?
I'm speaking the truth, I'm being genuine, and I'm being honest. That's what I'm doing, but I'm not going to share anyone's name on this. I did not know about that other letter, and had I known about it, there's no way I would have approved it.
Okay, we'll go to Ted now. Ted?
I want to ask you both about the city's finances, another major issue in this campaign. Nothing weighs more heavily on Providence's balance sheet than its unfunded obligations to its retirees and current workers. The city reached a settlement under Mr. Solomon's tenure as city council president with unions and retirees to reduce those obligations. And Mr. Solomon, I'll start with you. The city's actuary says Providence's pension system is still only 31% funded, with a long-term shortfall of $832 million after that settlement. Do you think the city can afford that $832 million left pension shortfall that's left?
That would, by the way, that would have been $980 million. It's $830. We didn't get into this hole overnight. This happened years and years, and it's going to take years and years to get out of this hole. But we have a plan, and I think for the last year and a half that we'll monitor this for the next 5 years and see how this plays out. But if it plays the way we expect it to play out, that this system will, at some point will get fully funded. And we're confident of that.
You said at the time that this settlement was approved, quote, "The intent of the council's pension reform efforts always has been to ensure the long-term health and sustainability of the retirement system."
Exactly.
So is the retirement system now sustainable?
Not right at this point, but it will be. It will be over time. It took a long time for us to get where we are today. And it's going to take a while to get to where we need to be.
So
it can't be done overnight. You can't just find that money overnight and expect to put it into a pension system and then become solvent.
There are really only two ways to whittle down a gap of that size apart from the investment returns on the money. Either taxpayers have to put the money in or the workers have to take smaller benefits. Are you ruling out further cuts in benefits? Will taxpayers have to foot that whole bill?
That's going to be done over a period of time. And the proper thing to do, as long as we fully fund our pension system, which we have ordinances in place now, you will see that number go down. And at some point, our system will be funded.
And it will go down because you expect the taxpayers to fully make the contributions
last
that have been called
Last year
for.
alone, we saved $17 million in pension reform. $17 million. So that's a reduction of taxpayers' dollars moving forward.
The other side of that is that more than $60 million is the annual deposit into the fund. That's about 10% of the city budget just going into the pension fund. Do you think that's an amount that Providence taxpayers can afford?
Listen, we're obligated to it. We're obligated to it unless you want to bankrupt the city. So I think that we made the changes we needed to make to move our city forward and to make sure and to ensure that we have a healthy pension system in the future.
Before we go to Mr. Elorza, I'll follow up on that then. The Republican candidate for mayor, Dan Harrop, has suggested perhaps Angel Taveras made a mistake and should have filed for city bankruptcy because the city's debts are just too burdensome. Is that something you would rule out, or would you consider municipal bankruptcy as mayor?
I would rule that out. Absolutely not.
There's no way Providence
will file
for
I would
bankruptcy.
never file bankruptcy in the city of Providence. We're a major city. We have a lot of assets in the city of Providence, so it's a little bit more complicated than what Dr. Harrop says.
All right, Mr. Elorza, I'd like to put the same question I just asked to you. Is filing for city bankruptcy an option that you consider on the table, or are you ruling it out if you become mayor?
So the only way we're going to get out of the fiscal hole that we find ourselves in is by being fiscally responsible and is by having an aggressive plan to grow jobs to build up our tax base. My opponent was on the city council for 8 years, and he was the chair of the finance committee. He was supposed to be
That
providing.
is not true, Judge.
I
wasn't chair of
apologize.
finance,
I
okay?
stand corrected. You sat on the finance committee and was supposed to be providing oversight so that the fiscal hurricane never occurred. I'm an accountant, and I'm going to watch every single dollar we spend at City Hall to make sure that it's being used effectively, and we're stretching every dollar. But in truth, over the long term, the only way that we're going to get out of this is by having an aggressive plan to grow on our economy and the and the tax base.
I did
That's
not hear
why
you rule out bankruptcy then there, Mr. Elorza. Please speak to that question specifically.
So
Is that an option?
to bankruptcy specifically, I will do everything I can to avoid us going into bankruptcy. It's still an uncertain process. It's only been tried at the municipal level in a few places. So it's uncertain what the legal outcome would be. It's uncertain what the economic outcome would be. And we're a capital city. It would be an embarrassment to the city and to the state if we go bankrupt. And I'm committed to doing everything I can and rolling up my sleeves to make sure that we do everything possible to avoid bankruptcy.
And let me ask you this, in light of the settlement that Mr. Solomon pushed through the city council, do you think the pension system is now sustainable in the city of Providence?
Well, we didn't get into this overnight, and it's over the long term and being fiscally responsible, watching every cent that we spend and being very careful about all of our decisions that we're going to fully fund the pension system. There's work left to be done, and I'm committed to doing whatever it takes with my accounting background, with my legal background, and surrounding myself by the best people that we have here in the city to grow our tax base so we can meet our full obligations.
Can you
and fully
promise
fund the
that
pension
retirees
system.
will get every cent they are currently expecting to get from the city of Providence in their pensions?
That's absolutely the intention, and I will do everything I can to make sure that that's the case.
We're going to do a rapid fire section here. I'm looking for one-word answers to these questions. We'll start left to right, and then I'll alternate the order. Mr. Elorza, yes or no, do you support driver's licenses for undocumented immigrants?
Yes, I do.
Yes.
Mr. Solomon?
Yes.
Say- Okay. Mr. Solomon, a letter grade for Providence Mayor Angel Taveras?
A.
Mr. Elorza?
Aye, incomplete.
Yes or no, if elected mayor, Mr. Elorza, will you keep Stephen Perry as Commissioner of Public Safety?
I have not made one promise about a position to anyone. I do not intend to tie my hands when I come into City Hall. Every decision I make will be based on merit when I evaluate the entire administration.
Okay, Mr. Solomon.
I do not discuss personnel matters.
All right, Mr. Solomon, yes or no, under the current deal the city is getting through nonprofits, do you think the city is getting enough money from nonprofits right now? Yes or no?
Yes.
Mr. Elorza?
We have to think of creative ways so that they can make even more contributions in ways that benefit the city.
Mr.
and the
Elorza,
nonprofits.
yes or no, is the city getting enough money from nonprofits?
No.
Yes or no, Mr. Elorza, would you support a law that would establish a legal market for licensed businesses to sell marijuana to adults 21 years of age or older?
Not at this time, no.
And
No.
Mr. Solomon, no. In 2001, Mr. Solomon, Mayor Taveras famously called the financial crisis in the city a Category 5 hurricane. Using the same hurricane scale, what category are we right now?
1.
Mr. Elorza?
A 3.
Yes or no, Mr. Elorza, would you support adding more charter schools in the city of Providence?
Oh, that's a big case-by-case question that has to be answered.
You would be open to more charter schools in Providence, is what you're saying, if it's case by case?
If that's the question, I would be open to it.
Okay, Mr. Solomon?
I thought it was one word.
Yes or no, then you can.
No.
No. I have to ask you, if I could follow up with you, Mr. Solomon, you supported Mayoral Academy Achievement First.
Yes, I did.
How is that different?
Well, I think we have enough charter schools right now in the city of Providence. Our goal is to improve our public school system. And I think right now we have...
Well, charter schools are public schools, aren't they?
But they're still, their curriculum is different than the public school curriculum.
Then why did
I
you
think-
support Achievement First?
Because at that time, I thought it was a good program, and I supported other ones too besides that. But I think right now we have enough charter schools, and we need to look at ways to improve our public schools.
Do you want to add to that, Mr. Elorza?
Sure. So my position on charter schools is that it's on a case-by-case basis. There are some charter schools that do a great job. There are some that not so much. So the question is, what is it that the great schools are doing? Why are they doing it? And then the most important question is, how can we import that into the public schools? So charter schools can be a laboratory for experimentation, but it only matters if we can do that to improve the traditional public schools, and that has to be the focus so we can give every single child the highest quality education possible.
All right, Ted.
We want to ask you both about potholes. There are a few things that seem to get more discussion when it comes up on Twitter and emails from viewers, etc. And we want to ask a very simple question. We'll start with you, Mr. Solomon. What is your plan to improve the condition of the city's roads, and a reasonable plan that can be afforded in this financial environment?
Well, you know we're doing 60 miles of roads currently. We've invested 40. We've borrowed 40 million, but we've invested it into our roads, into our infrastructure.
Do you think it's enough?
It's absolutely not. That's 25% of what we need to get done. But more importantly, we put an ordinance in a couple of months ago that any entity that has to tear up our streets. Before they make a 4x4 patch. Well, now when they tear up the street, they have to patch from corner to corner, curbstone to curbstone. So if somebody's making a small hole, they have to go from curbstone to curbstone to make to fill that patch in. And I think with that happening, you'll see a lot more of the National Grid, Providence Water being more careful on how they tear our streets up, because a lot of it has to do with, you know, the utilities tearing the streets up and not filling the holes back in properly.
That was my question, my follow-up. Do you think it's primarily a problem of utility companies tearing up the roads, or do you think it's also a lack of maintenance by the city itself?
Well, we have to do a better job, but we're short-handed right now. But constantly we have to look for new ways and new ideas and new ingredients or formulas to fill these potholes in. Product that stands the test of time and wear and tear. A lot of times we'll fill these potholes up, and 2 weeks, 3 weeks later, you have another pothole.
All right, Mr. Elorza, same question to you. Do you have any plans, any thoughts on how the city can affordably fill these potholes and get the roads in better condition?
Yes, I want to be the chief pothole filler in the city.
A line you stole from your new supporter, Brett Smiley.
I had it first. So I want to be the chief pothole filler in the city.
How?
Okay, so I've committed that in my first 90 days, I'm going to bring in a permanent director at the Department of Public Works. We've had an interim director for the past couple of years, and this person can help coordinate with each of the public utility agencies so that anytime they dig into a road, they already have the responsibility to fill the patch and to bring it up to grade, and then to maintain it over at least a couple of years. But many utilities, they simply don't fulfill their responsibility. We need someone at DPW that's going to hold them accountable to make sure they're fulfilling their responsibility. And I also agree. We need to make sure that whenever the utility companies are digging into the road, they have to fill the hole from curb to curb, because once you break the integrity of the surface, that's when the bulk of the potholes materialize. And so I'm committed to doing whatever it takes and to thinking creatively to address the issue. And we can learn from Boston as well on this. They've integrated technology into the work that they do. So they have the see-click-fix system or some version of it. And we can have something like that here at City Hall. You know, we have ProvConnects online, but it's not fully automated, and people haven't fully bought into it. In Boston, they've made it a social experience so that everyone is involved in making sure they're reporting and following up on potholes. We need a system like that in Providence.
Thank you, Mr. Elorza. And a quick follow-up to Ted's question. Mr. Solomon, you said that the city is short-handed. Does that mean you plan on hiring more people to the DPW's highway department if you become mayor?
That's something we would look at, absolutely. If it's in the budget and we could fit it into our budget in a responsible way, absolutely.
All right, let's stick with cars. There are a few things we hear more complaints about than the car tax. Providence tops the list. Mr. Solomon, we'll start with you. You've proposed raising the exemption, but as council president, you passed budgets that slashed the exemption, which meant the residents of Providence pay more in car taxes. If this is so important to your campaign, why didn't you do something about it then?
Tim, we were looking at a $110 million structural deficit. The exemption from the state went from $5,500 to $1,000. We lost $25 million from the state of Rhode Island that supplemented the car tax.
You said the exemption from the state.
Went from $5,500. No, the state was reimbursing Providence. They're giving us less. They were giving us $25 million less. We had no choice. Nobody likes to raise taxes. But now that we've gotten ourselves in a position where we could look at it, and I found a way where we could reduce that tax without putting a burden on the homeowners or on the investors, on the commercial properties. And what I propose to do is all the new jobs that are created from the nonprofits, our hospitals, our universities, our colleges, all the new jobs that are created, that I would ask the General Assembly to give Providence 33% of that income tax dollars, and we would use that money to offset the car tax.
That does sound like a great idea, but as you just said right there, you need to get approval from the General Assembly. Have you talked to House Speaker Nick Mattiello about it?
I have spoken to him about it, and I've talked to a lot of legislators about it, and it's a good plan, and I think it works, and I will go up to the State House personally and lobby for that piece of legislation.
Did the Speaker give you the thumbs up that he's going to allow that to happen?
Well, I didn't get a thumbs up or a thumbs down, but they're willing to listen. And that's the first step.
Mr. Elorza, your response.
Yeah, so you're right, Tim. So as I talk to people around the city, what they most complain about is the car tax. And you're right, my opponent in this race, he voted to increase the car tax, particularly on older cars, older lower value cars, but actually lowered the tax rate for any cars over $24,000. So I think that we're going in the wrong direction if we're lowering the tax on higher price cars and raising the tax on lower price cars. My solution to this problem, and what I hear from people throughout the city, is people understand that we all have to pay taxes. But right now, the valuation of the cars is completely out of whack. People are paying taxes on the retail value of the car and not on what the car is actually worth. So you have an old junker that really isn't worth more than $500, but it's being valued by the city at a level of $2,500, $3,000, and people see that as a slap in the face. And so what I've proposed is, over time, adjusting the valuation of the cars so that with time it'll come to be valued on what the car is actually worth. That's the right and just way to do it.
And as mayor of Providence, how are you going to do that? That takes General Assembly approval as well, just like Mr. Solomon's plan. Have you talked to House Speaker Nicholas Mattiello about that idea?
So it actually doesn't take state approval. So I've read the statute, and they say that the statute says that the value of the cars is based on the level that the state sets or a uniform percentage thereof. So if cars are consistently overvalued by, say, 20%, we can take 20% off the value of all the cars, and I want to do this over time in a responsible way, so that with time the value of the cars will be exactly what they're actually worth for the tax rolls.
And where would that lost revenue come from? Where would that lost revenue come from?
I did ask Mr. Solomon that same question. How do you pay for it? I'll give you 30 seconds here. I've let you go a little long.
So we have to be responsible for it over time. The only way we're going to get out of this mess at City Hall and our fiscal issues is by growing the economy and creating new jobs. Just as my opponent's plan relies on new jobs being created by the nonprofits, if we have job growth and if we have additional revenues to the city, I want to find ways to lower the burden on folks with the car tax.
So lowering the burden is tied to also lowering the unemployment rate. Did I hear that right?
Oh, absolutely. The only way we're going to fix our fiscal issues is by growing our tax base.
Mr. Solomon, 30 seconds response.
That's fine and good in theory, but we have other problems in the city of Providence. To say that all the additional tax dollars that we receive in the city of Providence are going to go to reduce the car tax, what about all the other taxes? We have homeowners, we have landlords, we have the commercial tax base that we've frozen and committed to freeze for the next 7 years because we need to expand our commercial tax base. And by the way, we've started doing that. This year, for the first time, we went from number one, the highest in the country in commercial tax rate, to the fourth highest in the country. And we've actually expanded our commercial tax base this year. But to say we're going to take that money and put it directly into the car tax, what about the homeowners? What about the non-homeowners, the non-owner-occupied houses? There has to be, and we have contracts that are coming up with unions. I mean, we have cost of living increases, the cost to do business in the city of Providence. I don't see how that could possibly happen.
Okay, we're going to move on. We're halfway through this debate now, so we're going to go to a question from Ted Nesi.
I want to ask each of you questions about your records. We'll start with you, Mr. Elorza. You wrote in a 2010 Law Review article that the evidence shows it's, quote, overwhelmingly unlikely that the theist God exists. Therefore, you wrote it's constitutional to teach in public schools that apparently the God of Christianity and Judaism does not exist. Why do you believe that, and would you seek to implement that in the Providence public schools?
No, absolutely not. So this is a 60-page article.
And we do not have time for you to go through that. 60 seconds. What did you mean by that, and do you believe that?
Yeah, so this is a 60-page article, and it's a special definition of what the theist God means. So effectively, I wrote this article because there are a number of quote-unquote angry atheists arguing that since evolution is proved true, that therefore God doesn't exist. And I wrote this article to combat them and say that, look, you might be right on this small slice, but everything else that God entails remains intact. And so, so absolutely, you know, this I don't seek to have this being taught in the public schools. This is a hypothetical that I laid out over 60 pages in an academic article.
But you did write, quote, "It's overwhelmingly unlikely that the theist God exists." Are you
Yes.
saying, do you believe that yourself, or are you saying that's what these scientists believe?
So as narrowly defined within that article, then yes, I believe that. But that's a very special definition, you know, because there is so much more to what God entails. And so
it's not something you would seek to implement in the Providence public
Absolutely
schools. Mr. Solomon, on your record, I want to ask you, and Mr. Elorza alluded to it before, you did become city council president in 2011, but you were a sitting member of the council during former Mayor Cicilline's entire term, when we now know major financial problems were festering. So aren't you partly responsible for not doing more to make sure Mayor Taveras didn't inherit the mess that he did inherit?
Absolutely not. We went on the information that we were given during that Cicilline administration. So the information that was given to us was the only information available to us. And that's why, when I became council president, we put in new ordinances that required monthly reporting from the finance department, transparency, freedom of records. It was like pulling teeth to try to get the records from the auditors, from the finance department. And quite frankly, I was a freshman councilman, just learning my way around. But I made sure that Providence would never have that problem again. And that's why we implemented some of the toughest finance ordinances moving forward.
What's the biggest mistake, then, you think Mayor Cicilline made in his handling of the finances of the city in that second term that you would try to avoid if you become mayor?
I think he relied too much on people that worked for him, and I don't think he was getting the right advice, and he was getting the right numbers himself.
How much blame do you think Mayor Cicilline bears, then, for what happened?
Obviously, when you're the chief operating officer and chief executive officer of the city, the buck stops with you.
Mr. Solomon, you have answered a lot of questions about your loan from the infamous now Providence Economic Development Partnership, or PEDP. I want to ask you a different question. During PEDP's darkest days, while it was under federal investigation, you were on its board. But as WPRI.com reporter Dan McGowan reported, records show you attended only the first meeting and missed the next 18. Do you regret that?
Absolutely. I could not attend those meetings, and I made it perfectly clear when I was appointed that those meetings came at 12 o'clock noon. And in my business, 12 o'clock noon is a busy time for me. And I made it perfectly clear to the mayor that I could not serve. And I asked him to get a replacement for me on that board. And it just took a while for him to put a replacement there. But I made it perfectly clear up front I could not serve on that board.
Mr. Elorza, do you have a response to that?
Well, I don't know, and I don't know either way, so I'll take the councilman at his word. But what we do know is that this is part of a program that needs absolute reform. You know, the councilman, he has a PEDP loan, a taxpayer-backed loan, a sweetheart deal of 1% interest. You know, how many business owners around the city would kill for a 1% loan that hasn't been paid back in 27 years? And not only it hasn't been paid back in 27 years, this is also the subject of the ongoing ethics investigation where he has failed to disclose his interests. We need reform in the PEDP system, and I look forward to coming in as mayor and making sure we bring those reforms.
Mr. Solomon.
First of all, that loan was given to a corporation that I'm a minority partner in. Wasn't given to me directly. Number two, that 1% loan was the only way that that project would work. That loan was awarded for two things: to create jobs and spur economic development. In 1988, you could roll a bowling ball down Westminster Street and hit no one. Look at Westminster Street today, because we were pioneers. We're the first ones to have downtown living on Westminster Street, residential living. We have a business in there. We've created jobs. We spurred economic development. People started rebuilding their property around us, which raised the taxes. So I'm proud of that loan. Did it go the way I wanted it to go? No, it did not. We went through 3 recessions. But I will tell you this, I stayed committed to that loan. I did not walk away from it. And today, we are current with the loan. We continue to be current with the loan. And we reduced the principal by $50,000 this year alone. And I have not seen 1 cent from this project.
Mr. Elorza.
The PEDP loan is part of a revolving fund. And so when these monies get paid back, the city can then loan it to another business so that they can create jobs. Instead of paying back the loan, my opponent, he has loaned his campaign almost $300,000. He must pay back the taxpayers so that then the city can lend this money to another small business that can create more jobs here in the city. It's irresponsible to loan your campaign the money and not pay back the taxpayers of the city. We need reform on the PEDP system, and I will bring it.
Final word on this, Mr. Solomon.
That is a loan that I'm committed to paying. I'm paying the terms of that loan. I don't think there's one person in the city of Providence that applied for a loan that couldn't get it because there wasn't enough money for them. So we're committed to the loan. We'll continue to pay on the loan. That loan, as I said, has done what it was set out to do: create jobs and spur economic development, and I'm proud of that.
Mr. Solomon, the response I was looking for was you did loan your campaign $300,000. Can you understand why that rubs people the wrong way?
Absolutely not. People do business
You
deals.
don't understand how that rubs people the wrong way?
No, because that project has to stand on its own merits. Every project stands on its own merit. When somebody comes to the city of Providence and says, I have a project in front of me, but the only way it's going to work is if I get tax stabilization. Do I look at that person and say, well, you got enough money, you don't need tax stabilization? And they'll tell me, well, this project's not going to work. Do I tell them to walk away from it? These are separate projects. That project needs to stand on its own 2 feet. And we're committed to it. We continue to pay on it. When it wasn't going well, we still continued to pay on it.
Okay, thank you, Ted.
There is a huge shadow cast over this primary by, of course, Buddy Cianci, who's running as an independent in November. And we will, of course, have him in the debates for the general election. Both of you have been arguing you are the best positioned Democrat to defeat Mr. Cianci. Now, we don't want to spend 3 hours on this, but we'll start with you, Mr. Solomon. In 60 seconds or less, why are you the Democrat you think is best positioned to win the general election and defeat Mr. Cianci?
Because I've been cleaning up Buddy Cianci's mess for the last 4 years. Unfunded pension systems. The city of Providence, under Cianci's administration, we've been cleaning that up. The compounded COLAs that were given out during Cianci's administration, we've been cleaning that up. And that's why I feel that I'm the best candidate to defeat Buddy Cianci in November, because I have the experience, the vision, and I've cleaned up his mess.
Candidly, one thing you hear from Democrats is, well, Solomon's going to get sliced up by Cianci in debates because Cianci's such a gifted public speaker. What do you say to that?
We'll see about that. I feel very confident that I could sit next to him at a debate.
All right, Mr. Elorza, same question to you. Why are you the best positioned Democrat to, again, 60 seconds or less, to defeat Mr. Cianci?
Yeah. Well, there's a clear contrast between myself and Buddy Cianci. I offer a fresh perspective, a new voice, and a forward-thinking vision to create jobs, to fix our schools, and to change the culture at City Hall. So there's that clear contrast. However, there's also the second point. Simply thinking politically and thinking about the votes. The city has changed demographically in very significant ways since Buddy Cianci was last mayor. The coalition that we're building here in our campaign, with supporters from throughout the city, is going to make it extremely difficult, if not impossible, for Buddy Cianci to come back into City Hall. And there's an emerging consensus with people commenting on the race, with reporters talking online, that the clearest shot to beat Buddy Cianci is presented by me, and Buddy Cianci is licking his chops to go up against my opponent in the general election. I present an alternative, and I will beat Buddy Cianci.
Well, I don't know if referencing reporters helps or hurts your case, but I'll move on. Mr. Solomon, you hear it right there, and people say it. They say, you know, a young Latino lawyer, Harvard-educated, sounds like Angel Taveras. Angel Taveras won overwhelmingly. Mike Solomon, an older white gentleman, he can't do it.
Older.
You know,
I'm 57 years old. I've been on the council 7 years. You guys are ready to bury me. Come on.
Well, what do you say to the criticism more seriously?
Listen, I'm prepared to take on Buddy Cianci, and I'm sure Buddy Cianci does not want to run against Mike Solomon. I can guarantee you that.
Mr. Elorza, Federal Hill has been in the headlines lately and not on the food pages, unfortunately. A recent streak of violence has brought negative light on one of the state's marquee destinations. What do you think? Is this a string of bad luck for the Hill, or is there a fundamental problem up there?
Yeah, no, there has been a fundamental problem for a while, and I'm very encouraged to see many of the merchants and retailers and restaurant owners coming together to take back Federal Hill. When I used to travel around the country, if people knew two things about Rhode Island, they knew Newport and they knew Federal Hill. That's the stature that Federal Hill should be at. And I look forward to working with each of the constituents on Federal Hill to develop a long-term vision and a long-term plan for where we want Federal Hill to be, and then execute on that plan, because Federal Hill must be this premier destination that it has always been.
So briefly,
and I'm excited about the changes that we're seeing.
Briefly, before I go to Mr. Solomon, what is the fundamental problem on the Hill then, if you think there is one?
Yeah. So part of the issue is that it used to be primarily restaurants. But then we changed to many restaurants having DJs, sometimes in violation of ordinances, staying open too late, and a lack of security on Federal Hill. It's gotten to the point where people are now scared to come to Federal Hill. That's a sad state of affairs. That's not the way it's supposed to be. So I look forward to working with them on security. I look forward to having a no-tolerance attitude to anyone who violates the city ordinances and is bringing in DJs of full-line clubs after the restaurants close. There's a lot that we can do to turn around Federal Hill.
Mr. Solomon.
We all know that Federal Hill is a global destination, and we knew back in 2012 that there were problems on Federal Hill, and that's why we put a moratorium on entertainment licenses. But unfortunately, there were 5 or 6 businesses that already had those entertainment licenses, and that's where the problem seems to be. So we're working with the restaurant owners to try to figure this out and see what we can do to curb that problem. We know we're understaffed with the police. We need more police officers, and obviously we have the academy graduating of 50 police officers in a few months, but we're lack of police officers down there. And when all these clubs get out at 2 o'clock in the morning, it's no matter how many people you have down there, it's not a good scene. It's not a good scene. So I think what we have to do is maybe cut back on those hours that these entertainment license holders have, and maybe reduce it to 12 midnight. And I think that would solve a lot of problems on Federal Hill.
Some people up there think all nightclubs should just be kicked off the Hill. Do you feel that way?
There are some lounges that fit. Obviously, they have restaurants that have lounges, and they play music. But the thing that I see is they close at midnight. And I see when they close at midnight, it has a tendency to keep away a lot of the undesirables that want to go and obviously spend $3 for a drink.
Okay, thank you. Ted?
Mr. Elorza, you made waves recently when you said you find interesting the possibility of creating a municipal income tax in Providence. Now, I know you furiously backpedaled to say you're not going to implement one, but I want to hear first, why does the idea interest you, and how would it work? Who would be taxed in a municipal income tax, even if you're not going to try to implement one?
So, we always have to be open about a conversation to make our tax structure much fairer and much more just. But right now is not the time for a new tax here in Providence.
Granted, but I want to hear about why you find interesting a municipal income tax and how that would work.
Well, in other cities, in big cities such as New York, it's been used to reduce the burden on property owners and property taxpayers and also car taxpayers.
Who pays it?
Folks who work in the city. So it might work for other places, but right now is not the time for Providence to adopt a new tax. The only way we're going to resolve our fiscal issues is by growing the economy, and that's why I have an aggressive jobs program to develop the working waterfront, where we create 1,500 jobs in the next 5 years, where we retain our talent and having more of our university graduates stay here so that we reverse the brain drain, and supporting our small businesses so that they can continue to grow.
You told the Progressive Democrats of America that you are, quote, very much in support of a municipal income tax. That did come from your former opponent's campaign, but Dan McGowan reviewed the video and found that you had said you were very much in support of it. Is this a flip-flop?
No, I like the idea, and I like the idea because it's been tried in other places, but those are different places. Whether it makes sense for Providence is a completely different question, and I've been clear that raising taxes is simply not an option, and the only way to get out of this is by economic growth.
All right, I want to bring Mr. Solomon in. Would you consider a municipal income?
He said it, not me.
well, we got to get you on the record.
Absolutely not. Absolutely
no
not.
interest.
No
You also
interest
hear
in
the skepticism about any tax increases. Mr. Solomon, to stick with you, Mr. Elorza saying, and you've made similar comments, and yet the city's balance sheet is what it is. There's already a significant multi-million-dollar deficit projected for what would be your first term in office. Can you really promise there won't be tax increases? Isn't that inevitable?
Nobody likes to pay taxes. Nobody likes tax increases. And it's always a last resort. But we will do all we can to hold the line on a tax increase in the city of Providence. And I'm confident this year you won't see a tax increase.
This year, the current year that we're in, or your first year if you were elected mayor?
Well, I haven't gotten the budget for my first year in May, but this year there's no tax increase. We held the line on taxes this year with no tax increase. And that is my goal moving forward. Like I said, the only way we get out of this hole is growing our commercial base. And if we can grow our commercial base, we could hold the line on taxes.
But you can't rule out raising taxes your first year in office.
Nobody could rule out raising taxes. I think, let's face it, that's a last resort. We'll do everything in our power to make sure that doesn't happen.
And if you have to go to that last resort, you and Mayor Taveras have made a big deal out of a freeze on the commercial tax rate. Are you pledging to continue that freeze, or was that something you'd be open to revisiting if you need to raise taxes?
If we see that the commercial tax base is growing, I will continue that freeze. If we see the levy growing of income coming in from the commercial tax rate base, I will definitely keep that freeze on, absolutely.
Mr. Solomon, we'll stay with you. By any metric, the city of Providence is failing its students. Diagnose the schools in the city.
First and foremost, we need to rebuild our schools, and I've said that from day one. Our schools are a mess. We drive by, we see four walls. We don't see what's inside those four walls. And I've toured a lot of those schools, and they're appalling. And I will tell you, leaky roofs, drafty windows, fire system, fire code, not up to fire code. We can't have our children in that type of environment learning. Okay, we need to start rebuilding our schools. And I put a 10-year plan together to rebuild our schools. And I'm going to stick by that plan and get that plan to work. And that's an important thing that we need. Our children need first-rate learning centers. They need computers at their desks. They need a smart board at the top of the classroom, the head of the classroom.
Mainly your answer was about infrastructure with the actual buildings. What about what happens inside the schools?
I think the schools, first and foremost, we need stability. We've had 5 superintendents in the last 12 years, 13 years. That's very important, stability, because we can't expect our children to learn when the curriculum's changing every 3 to 4 years because a new superintendent comes in. What we need to do is more autonomy in the schools. I really believe schools should be more autonomous.
What does that mean?
It means strong principals running their schools, teachers, strong teachers at the head of every classroom that could tailor their teaching methods to the needs of the children, and then some middle management money. Get it and let it flow into the classrooms. Eliminate some of the middle management jobs and let the money go directly to classrooms for courses like for music, for the arts, for computer science, things that are not in their everyday curriculum, and tutors. We need to teach our kids at a young age how to read. I mean, early intervention is important. If they're not reading by 3rd grade level in the 3rd grade, that child's challenged, because after 3rd grade, it's reading to learn. And if you can't read, you can't learn.
Okay, and before we go to Mr. Elorza, you said you want to stop some of the turnover at superintendent. Does that mean you would stick with Susan Lucy?
I'm not making any.
But you don't want to see turnover.
I don't want to see turnover, but I'm not commenting on any personnel. I haven't commented on personnel throughout the whole campaign, and I'm not going to change now.
Mr. Elorza, diagnose the schools in the city.
Yeah. Well, this is one area where the councilman and I differ very, very significantly. I've mentioned that if I'm remembered for one thing, I want to be remembered as the mayor that turned around our schools. Now, Councilman Solomon has released a plan to borrow $250 million, a plan that relies on the state saying yes to what they've already said no to. It's simply not going to work. I believe in full-service community schools. Districts throughout the country have done this already. And what this is that right now our buildings, our school buildings, are used for less than half of the day, and they're used for less than half of the year. It's such an inefficient use of space. And what I want to do is not create new programs or services, but I want to take all of the programs and services that already exist and bring them inside of the building. So imagine that a parent comes into the school building to take English classes. And as they're learning English, those classes are synchronized with the instruction their children receive during the day, so that the parent can then help the child with their homework. Or perhaps a parent comes in for a dentist appointment at the school, and as they're leaving the dentist appointment, there's a PTO meeting about to begin, or a community meeting. It's about bringing the entire community together around the school, where we create a culture of excellence that surrounds every child. I also believe that we need more site-based management. We have 39 schools in our district. There is no reason why we can't have 39 phenomenal, high-achieving principals leading each and every one of these buildings. And I want to see more decision-making authority flow from central administration, and I want to put it on the front lines where it deserves so that teachers can be flexible and creative in their own curriculum.
Okay, we're running short on time, so I want to get to a question from Ted.
Mr. Solomon, we'll start with you. There's been a continued debate about whether Providence's Allens Avenue waterfront should continue to be used industrially for heavy commercial uses. Mr. Cianci often complains about how the scrap metal there looks. Do you think Providence should allow residential and other mixed uses on the waterfront, or do you think it should continue to be focused on heavy industrial use?
Heavy industrial use. That's a working waterfront. And by the way, all that scrap metal is creating jobs, lots of jobs for people in our city. So that has to be done somewhere. We need to encourage more use of the water.
But industrial use, you do not want to see residential?
No, absolutely not. Residential, industrial. I know it works in some other cities, but Providence, it's too small of an area. I've seen it work in other cities. I've seen it work in Montreal, but it will not work in Providence because the area is too small.
Sticking with you, what do you think of the aesthetic criticism Mr. Cianci is making, which is just it looks ugly? It's a bad image of Providence as people go along 95 through the city.
Put some shrubs up. They have shrubs up there. I mean, obviously, it's a.
Those are pretty tall shrubs, Mr.
I know
Solomon.
that. By the way, just so you know, the first set that were put up, somebody took them down, literally walked away with them. But more importantly, it's a working waterfront. It's a working waterfront. Unfortunately, it's there, and I know they're working 3 shifts, trying to get the scrap metal out as fast as it comes in. Aesthetically, obviously it doesn't look good, but that's the business that's over there.
All right, Mr. Elorza, same question to you. Do you support continuing heavy industrial use as the sole use of the Allens Avenue waterfront, or would you consider residential and mixed use?
So this has been my signature economic development plan, to develop the working waterfront where we double our exports in the next 5 years. So this is one of our greatest underutilized assets here in the city. We have one of only 2 deep water ports in all of New England. They say that it's such an underutilized resource that it's as if we built the highway, but then
running
used
one
the
time,
highway.
what would you want to do to make it used better then?
I want to realize its full potential.
How?
So I have a plan to double our exports in the next 5 years. First of all, we have to sit down with Provport and make sure that we have a long-term plan. We've never had that. We've thought, is it going to be high-end residential? Is it going to be something else? We need a plan and a vision for the future. We have to zone that land for heavy industrial use, and we have to give confidence to any investors or any developers that the city is committed to developing it as a working waterfront.
Mr. Solomon, very briefly, anything you disagree with there? Are you guys on the same page?
We're on the
30
same
seconds,
page.
please.
Heavy industrial.
All right, with less than 2 minutes until your closing remarks, I have some brief questions for the both of you. Mr. Solomon, if Mr. Elorza wins the primary, will you endorse him?
Absolutely.
And but I have to ask, you said he was unfit to be mayor, so how does that?
That's good because he's running against me.
So that's campaign rhetoric.
I would support him for mayor.
Okay, Mr. Elorza, if Mr. Solomon wins the primary, would you endorse Mr. Solomon?
I would.
Okay.
He didn't say anything bad about me.
And Mr. Elorza, who are you supporting for Rhode Island governor?
I'm supporting Angel Tavares.
And Mr. Solomon, who are you supporting?
I've worked with Angel Tavares. I feel comfortable with him. He knows Providence, and I'm sure he'd make a good governor.
Less than a minute left. He's been a punching bag in the primary for both of you. So can you say anything nice about Buddy Cianci, Mr. Solomon?
No comment.
Okay, Mr. Elorza, anything nice to say about Buddy Cianci?
Oh, we're actually neighbors. Our campaign headquarters are right next to each other. When they moved in, we said, there goes the neighborhood.
That's a no for both of you. All right. Well, I want to make sure we give you each enough time to give your closing remarks. So why don't we dive into that? And again, I want to point out to the audience at home that the order for closing remarks was determined by a drawing, and each of these closing remarks is 60 seconds long. According to the drawing, we're going to begin with Michael Solomon. Mr. Solomon, your 60-second closing remarks.
Thank you, Tim. Thank you, Ted. I love this city. I'm invested in this city, and I'm committed to this city. I'm the only candidate that has the proven track record to move this city forward, the experience to move this city forward. 3.5 years ago, the city was looking at a $110 million structural deficit. Today, we have a $1.6 million operating surplus, and I'm proud of that. But we need to move Providence forward. We need to make Providence a city of opportunity for everyone. And when I announced my candidacy back in January, I said it would be about schools, jobs, and neighborhoods. So I respectfully ask for your support on September 9th for mayor of the city of Providence. And together, we can make Providence a brighter future for all. Thank you.
All right, Mr. Solomon, thank you very much. Now, Jorge Elorza. Mr. Elorza, your 60-second closing remarks.
There's a clear choice in this race. I presented a forward-thinking vision where we create jobs here in the city through a working waterfront. I presented a plan for full-service community schools where we engage the entire community. And we're going to change the culture at City Hall so it's not politics as usual and we have a city government that works for you. My opponent, however, represents the politics of the past, from a sweetheart loan that hasn't been paid back in 27 years, from soliciting contributions from city employees, something that hasn't been done since the days of Cianci, to an ongoing ethics investigation. We have to nominate a Democrat that's a clear contrast to Buddy Cianci and that will win in November. I am that candidate, and I ask for your vote.
Thank you, Mr. Elorza, and my thanks to both of the candidates for joining us on today's debate. And our coverage of Campaign 2014 is hardly over yet. Be sure to tune in Tuesday, September 2nd at 7 p.m. live from the Providence Performing Arts Center. Republican gubernatorial candidates Alan Fung and Ken Block square off in an hour-long commercial-free debate that will be streaming live on WPRI.com and, of course, on WPRI 12. And don't forget to go on to WPRI.com to submit your questions. Then primary day, of course, is September 9th. Most polls open at 7 a.m. Check with the Secretary of State's website for your town's exact time. The polls close then at 8 p.m. Make sure you bring a valid photo ID with you to your polling location. WPRI 12 and WPRI.com is your source for Campaign 2014 of coverage that night. And of course, in the Providence mayoral race, you must read Dan McGowan from WPRI.com. He has the inside scoop on this entire race. We'll bring you the results as they come in on September 9th. I want to thank you for watching this special edition of Newsmakers, a debate among the major Democratic candidates for Providence mayor. For Ted Nesi, I'm Tim White, and we will see you next week on Newsmakers.